Well, yesterday we left off talking about Paul's preliminary hearing before the Roman court. It's real possible that the emperor himself could have been there at that point because it was basically something that was required that the emperor would hear these kind of things. One historian once said the reason that many of the emperors died young was because Roman law required them to listen to any Roman citizen who had a complaint, and this could take days and days of time. Although we know that Nero delegated a lot of that, and later emperors did the same. They delegated to others who were judges. But nonetheless, at some point, especially if somebody was going to be condemned, then the emperor had to be present. So whether he was there or not, we don't know. But I like the way Paul puts it when he says, I was delivered from the lion's mouth. And that's his description of the emperor. The emperor is a ferocious, voracious, animalistic individual who was probably certifiably insane, certainly was a total sociopath. His behavior is beyond description and how horrible and cruel he was. But the whole point was, Paul realized that the lion was like Daniel being thrown in the lion den. He was, basically fresh meat. But he said, the Lord rescued me, and he has from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. So that Paul realized that regardless of how this goes, I'm going to be delivered. I'm either going to be delivered and found innocent and allowed to continue my ministry, or I'm going to be executed and I'm going to go home to receive my reward. And so Paul, as he told the Corinthians in his second letter in chapter 5, he said, right now God is keeping me alive because that's more profitable to you. But if there comes a point where it's no longer necessary or profitable for me to continue my ministry, then the Lord's going to take me home. So Paul lived, as he said in his own words, that he lived with a kind of sentence of death inside of himself. He saw himself as a man who was condemned by the culture that hated the message, and they had made numerous attempts to kill him. And he said, I understand that sooner or later that's exactly what they're going to try to do to me as well. And so basically he said, to God be the glory forever and ever and ever. And then he moves on and he says, greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Now it's interesting, Priscilla and Aquila were these a husband and wife that had ministered with Paul in Corinth, and they'd ministered with Paul in Ephesus. We don't know a great deal about them. One of the interesting things about the story is that the first time we meet him, it's Aquila and Priscilla, and thereafter in the text, it's always referred to Priscilla first and then Aquila first. How they ministered, what their co-laborers were together, we just know that they were both really powerful preachers of the gospel and very effective teachers of the scriptures. And Paul honored and recognized them for their service within the church. And I'd like to touch on that sometimes because I think oftentimes we diminish the role of women in particular, and even wives, like Islam says that women should stay home, have babies, cook food, and provide sexual pleasures to the husband. That's their entire role in the world. But Christianity, oftentimes we find that being parroted as well in the church, and it's not true. That women are not only mothers, they're not only husbands or wives, and they are homekeepers and all the rest of that stuff, but they're also oftentimes effective ministers, as we find many times in the church. And I don't know where the church would be where the church would be without these women who serve in so many areas of ministry. But also they're effective in the mission field as well. And so there are many couples that I've known who labor as husband and wife. They have different gifts and callings, but basically they're a team. And many times that's the way I look at it with my wife and I. She's not a Bible teacher. She's not a preacher. She very clearly says that's not my role. Although I have to admit, even today, there's so many times when my wife will share something that she's read in the Word, and I go, that's something I can incorporate into my text. So I don't want to admit how many things that she shares that end up becoming some of the more stellar points of my messages. But the whole point is that we share everything together. We're husband and wife. We're joined at the hip, and I couldn't do what I do without her support and her love and her approval and her affection and her forgiveness. I couldn't do any of that. And that's why we become co-laborers. And that's what Priscilla and Aquila were. They were a match set. Where you saw one, you saw the other. And then he goes on to talk about the household of Onesiphorus, where he's talking about really home churches. And remember, Onesiphorus was a guy who had come from Philippi with financial support for Paul in his first imprisonment. And so this was a church who had been a faithful financial supporter of Paul as he ministered in a variety of other places. And that's kind of where we derive our concept today, where we have people who go into the mission field, but they're being supported by the believers who are staying at home. And that's not something that was just created in the 20th century. That's something we find here in the first century. The early church oftentimes gave financial support to those who were out doing the work, like the Apostle Paul. Then he goes on to say Erastus stayed in Corinth. Well, who is Erastus? Well, in Corinth, we're told that Erastus was the treasurer of the city. So Erastus was a government official who was highly influential and powerful, and Paul said he chose to remain in Corinth. He's not criticizing him for him, but then he goes on to say, and I left Trophimus because he was sick. He was in Miletus. He was unwell. He was unhealthy and could not come with him. So Paul's talking about what took place when Paul is arrested and he's being taken back to Rome. He's passing through these cities, and each city, people from the church are coming out to see him, and some are going with him and some are staying home. And Trophimus was probably one of those guys who wanted to come with Paul, but he was physically ill. And I often like to point out about Trophimus that when people tell me that God heals everybody that's sick, and if you have enough faith, you'll be healed. And yet Paul very openly says, I had to leave him behind because he was ill. He had an illness. Paul probably prayed for him. I can't even doubt that Paul prayed for him, but he was too sick to come with him. And it's interesting because he says of Trophimus in another passage that he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. So when Paul refers to his first imprisonment, Trophimus was a guy who was there to refresh Paul. In what ways we're not told exactly, but he wasn't afraid of the fact that Paul was a prisoner in chains. And so I think that Trophimus really wanted to come with Paul, but couldn't because of his physical disability, his sickness that limited him and kept him from coming. And then he goes on to say, do your best to get here before winter. Obviously, remember he asked for the cloak? He says, I want you to get here before it starts getting really, really cold. And again, this may surprise some people if you've never been to Rome, but Rome in the wintertime can be pretty cold. I mean, it rains, the winds can blow, and the temperatures drop. It's not beautiful all year round. And so he said, make every effort to get here before it gets too cold. Then he says, Eubulus greets you, and so do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers. Well, I have to admit, we're not completely sure who these people are. They're not mentioned anyplace else. There's interesting historical background that may apply because there was a Pudens who was basically part of the royal family who was married to a British princess by the name of Claudia, who was also living in Rome. And some people speculated these are the same people, that they actually became Christians. In fact, one record, according to Tacitus, says that Claudia got in trouble because she became a follower of foreign gods, which may indicate that she became a Christian. So it could be that Pudens and Claudia were actually part of the church in Ephesus, and in Rome, and Paul is sending greetings from them. Eubulus may have been a church leader. Linus was the name of the first bishop of the church in Rome, so that may also be part of the church leadership. Now, we might ask the question, why did Paul say nobody stood with him and at his first accusation? And probably because these people couldn't offer any evidence in his behalf. They had no personal testimony that they could say, well, I know that Paul wasn't guilty of this. They just simply wouldn't have been considered a viable witness. But anyway, it's interesting as Paul has this group of people who are around them and everyone responding differently to his circumstances, that finally Paul says in his final comment to Timothy, the Lord be with your spirit and grace be with you. That ultimately Paul knew that this was the answer to everything. The Lord with you in spirit. You know, the Spirit of God is always with me. Christ lives inside of me. But you know what I find? If I don't refresh myself in His Word, and I don't refresh myself in prayer, times of just waiting upon the Lord, times of singing songs of worship and praising Him, that if I don't refresh myself in that, I forget that the Lord is with me. And when I forget that, I stop looking for grace in my life. and I start depending upon works. I start looking at external things and things that I can do to make a difference and fix problems and solve situations. And oftentimes it's only when I hit a wall of total frustration that I bend the knee to God and I say, God, help me. That God then says, well, I've been willing to help you all the time, but you just haven't called for me. You haven't invited me to be part of this process. So as my wife often says to me as I begin a project, she says, have you prayed first? Because she knows I'm not the handiest guy around. I have to read the instructions, watch how to do it on YouTube. And she just says, have you prayed first? Because so many times I think, oh, this will be easy, and I launch into it. And it never turns out to be easy. It's always more complicated than I thought. But when we stop and we pray, it's amazing how many times suddenly, oh, that's what I need to do. And so I would say that Paul's exhortation to Timothy isn't just God words that he put at the end of the letter. He's telling him, Timothy, remember that you need to be following the Spirit of God, relying and depending upon him, humbling yourself, so the grace of God can manifest itself in your life. And I would say you and I need to keep that in mind as well. Well, it's the end of the week. Thanks for hanging on. Next week, we'll start in the book of Titus, the little letter of Titus, which has some similarities to Timothy and yet also has some importantly unique qualities. So look forward to getting into that with you next week. God bless you and go in his grace.